Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Baig, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 93rd episode, which will be devoted to China. China had a torrid 2022, struggling to manage the pandemic, dealing with distress in the property and tech sectors, facing pushback from the US and its allies on technology and market access, etc. 2023 is off to a promising start, but could this be a false dawn? Well, let's get some expert views. Today's guest is a longstanding supporter of Kopi Time, Bert Hofman. Bert is the director of the East Asian Studies Institute at National University of Singapore and professor in practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School. Before joining NUS, he worked at the World Bank for 27 years, 22 of which were in Asia, and a dozen of those were in China, where he was country director for the World Bank from 2014 to 2019. Bert Hofman, a warm welcome back to Kopi Time. You're our first three-peat guest.
Great to be back, Taimur.
It's great to have you. Lots to talk about, but start with perhaps the pandemic. Bert, let's begin by taking stock of this remarkable turnaround that we have seen in the last few months.
Yeah, well, we're almost done with the turnaround. It almost looks as if the numbers are showing that. The rural areas are a bit different and they're less monitored than the urban areas, but there's been this tremendous wave starting sort of mid-December. By early January, it was already starting to peter out. And now over the Chinese New Year, we see a further decline in at least the infections as far as we know it. The data are far less strong than before because there's practically no more testing. But the government has incidentally reported on the infection rate, and that now seems to come down quite dramatically. So, just 3 months ago, we were thinking this was impossible, and now we're almost through with the Omicron wave. Of course, there's been lots of suffering. There's been many people that, because they were not vaccinated enough or simply because they were old, that died because of Omicron. But it seems to be that from now on, at least the economic recovery can really take hold.
But what does it say about pandemic management? I mean, now we are in the third year of this pandemic, and in the rest of the world, the mRNA vaccines played a very large role in that pandemic management process. In the case of China, that wasn't the case. Does it mean that whether you have the right vaccine or the wrong vaccine, or rather the more effective vaccine and not so effective vaccine, you sort of go through the same narrative?
Well, I think what happened in China would have in part be avoidable. First, I don't think that the local vaccines are that much less effective. It just takes 3 shots of them. China did a lot of vaccination in 2021, but then it sort of petered out, in part because they were so successful. And they made a tactical mistake in the beginning to say, well, the vaccines are really for the working people because they go out and about and they need to be protected. The elderly, therefore, had the impression that maybe this was not such a great idea for them. And of course, elderly are also more vulnerable to any side effects of vaccination. But the vaccine themselves are pretty effective, not as effective as the mRNAs, but pretty high effectiveness after 3 vaccines. The problem is that a lot of people got their third vaccine, their third shot already quite a while ago. So maybe they were not under the most recent wave. At the same time, Omicron is far lighter. The impact of Omicron, even if you're not vaccinated, is far milder than, say, the Delta variant, which caused a lot of deaths in the United States and in Europe. So in that sense, it did pay for China to wait. But of course, it came at considerable cost. And I think that in the end was a big factor for China to move out of COVID, zero COVID policy relatively quickly. I would say too quickly, in November, December last year. The other part of the exit was, of course, the demonstrations that took place. I mean, the people were basically fed up. There was in early November, there was after the party Congress, there was an announcement, okay, we're going to do the 20 points program. And that basically was a gradual exit from zero COVID. But the effect was that infections shot up and local governments still clamped down by means of lockdowns. And that triggered then the protest. I think by then already the infections rates were so high that frankly it was almost unstoppable. And again, I think a more phased exit would have been desirable. But as the great Donald Rumsfeld said, it is what it is. And now we are looking at a recovery to this 3 years really of COVID management that did have results. There's no question about it. But China is now behind everybody else in the recovery phase. Mind you, none of the countries, except maybe where I live, Singapore, did it very well, that exit. Singapore went very carefully, very sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back in the exit. Took in total about 9 months to exit the zero COVID, or not the zero COVID, but the very strict COVID management that Singapore had. And I think that was a very good way to go about. But nevertheless, they also experienced a wave. They also experienced more death in the exit of their COVID management. So it was almost unavoidable. I'm not even speaking about other countries in Europe or the United States. The United States never exited because they never really entered a serious COVID management effort, except for the vaccines.
I want to talk about the vaccine for just one more moment, Bert, if I may. I saw a recent article by Joe Stiglitz where he basically accused Western pharma companies of hoarding the formula behind the mRNA vaccine. And his point was this should be a global public good. And if a company in China just wants to copy it and sell it, so be it, because it is an issue of global public health. Would an approach like that, let's say a year ago, would it have made a difference? Because it seemed to me a year ago, the narrative out of China was mRNA is a Western vaccine. And that was, I think, was very unfortunate. It should have been something seen as a global good.
Yeah, look, frankly, I don't think the price was an impediment for China. They could have afforded it. They chose not to. And they chose to pursue their own research in a local mRNA. I mean, the irony is that they were ready to produce it in China. The Pfizer BioNTech mRNA, they were ready to actually produce it on a major scale, but that they backed away from that. So I don't think price was an issue. It was in some developing countries it was an issue, and I think that whole system of incentives for innovation would for global public goods can be reconsidered. And if you want, indeed, if you go back 20 years, it was governments around the world that invested in the research that made the mRNA vaccine possible. But it was also companies that invested for 10 years, say, to commercialize the platform that made it in the end possible to produce the vaccine itself and to respond very quickly to the COVID-19 epidemic. So I think it's amidst a pandemic, you always say, well, they should give it away. But then the question is also, what's the impact on the next pandemic and the incentives to do RNA? If it is indeed purely government-financed R&D that leads to an outcome, one can consider to say, okay, maybe one should give it away.
Right. I think there are, in the middle of a big global crisis, I think there's always a tendency to, forget about long-term incentives, just get it done, get us out of the crisis, and then we'll see. But you're right. Companies like BioNTech and Moderna spent a decade or more investing in the whole mRNA technology infrastructure before, the timing came to be, ripe for them to be very, very effective around the world. I'm pretty sure that the Chinese pharma companies will also get certain strategic investments from the government of China in preparation for the next rainy day. Bert, macro, China, particularly the economic environment. So we, in the last, say, 2-3 months, have begun to pick up a pro-growth shift in economic policy. Would you like to sort of, express your take on what's been going on the economic front?
Well, so the numbers may not show that much yet, but if you want, the tone has clearly changed, and that is, I think, the watershed was the 20th Party Congress, which took place in October, and after that, some major speeches, but then particularly the Central Economic Work Conference reflects a far more, not just pro-growth stance, but also a far more friendlier stance towards the private sector, a friendlier stance even towards the previously maligned platform companies. So I think there has been some realization that some of the previous policy directions would not bring China where it wants to be, i.e. continue to grow. We're relatively high with, the informal target for the next 15 years is 4.75%. That rolls out if you take Xi Jinping's doubling of 2020 GDP by 2035. If you take that serious, you would need a growth rate of 4.75, and you would probably need a higher growth rate in the early years, given that there are factors such as demographics, such as other factors that would sort of bring in the later years, bring a lower growth rate. So, and the previous policy stance with big emphasis on controlling capital. In the 2021, so not the latest, but the 2021 Central Economic Work Conference, there was controlling of the wild expansion of capital by means of a traffic light system. So that all sounded quite scary. Now the tone is different, and some of the actions are quite, frankly, different. Policymakers have said, look, the rectification of the platform companies is now over. It doesn't mean it's not going to be any regulation, but it's going to be in a more normal regulatory process. So it's not catching up on previously lacking regulation. Didi Chuxin was allowed to take on new users on their platform for more than 2 years. They couldn't do that. So there's some positive signals there that promise a bit more in the coming years. I'm careful there because tone does not yet mean real policies, and I think it will take some time to see whether there's truly a new direction under the new team that Xi Jinping has put in place, and the transition will be completed by March. And then we will probably see some more evidence of a change in direction at, say, the third plenum, which is traditionally about economic policy. So that would be somewhere in the fall. So I'm a bit careful. I think a lot of investors are still a bit careful. And that, of course, brings you to this year's growth picture, where a lot of people expect the big rebound in consumption, the revenge consumption coming after COVID. I'd be a little bit modest in my expectations. Yes, there will be a bump in consumption, but there's still lots of uncertainties out there. So the savings rate of household may remain quite big. Second, the part of the reason why the household saves so much is indeed, as you mentioned, the property sector. So they couldn't invest in their traditional and favorite investment, i.e. apartments. That by itself was not a great idea anymore. But there's very few alternative investment vehicles for China. Maybe stocks will get a bit more of a boost there. And yes, they'll allocate a bit more in if you want, durable goods such as cars and otherwise. But whether that is going to be a major driver of growth, after all, household consumption is only 38% of GDP by now. It has come down again from almost 40 a couple of years back. And so you still need that investment component to drive growth. Externally, it doesn't look very good. I may not be as pessimistic as some, including the IMF. Some say that the Europe and the US for sure are going to be in a recession. I frankly I'm not so sure if I look at the numbers, but I'm not the expert there. Irrespective, external demand is not going to drive China's growth. I think we can agree on that. So that investment growth is still very, very important. Overall investment is still more than 40% of GDP. And then the question is, okay, so part of that, of course, is government investment, and especially government investment in infrastructure. Well, the ones that need to do that is local governments, and they're by now pretty tight. They don't have enough revenues, and they have loaded up quite a bit of formal debt on the books and informal debt through the local government financing vehicles that are enjoying a second leash of life. They were supposed to have been phased out after 2015, but they're sort of back and thriving. And yes, it's not formal government debt, but nevertheless, local governments are probably going to be held responsible for it. So maybe not as much as before, maybe not as much impetus will come from infrastructure. Property we've talked about, maybe not as much impetus from property, simply because the mess in the property sector still needs to be sorted out. And if I had a couple of $100,000 in China, I'm not sure whether this year would be the moment to buy an apartment that would be delivered 2-3 years from now with a company that I'm not sure whether it will be around 2-3 years from now. So I think there's still a lot of uncertainty there. It will probably stabilize at a much lower level, but it won't be a major driver of growth. So that then the remaining part is business investment, both public and private. It's a surprisingly low share of GDP by now. Government has stopped publishing the numbers, unfortunately, so we can't really determine it, but some of the estimates that we have shows that it's only 12 to 14% of GDP is business investment. So it's less than a third of total investment. But there's somewhat more optimism coming from the more positive tone that the Central Economic Work Conference and other major policy actions provide for investors in public and private businesses. That might give a bit of a boost. But overall, the picture is not that this is going to be a massive rebound and we're going to be up in the 7-8% range. It sounds. We don't do any formal projections, but 5 to 6 is probably a good number to focus the mind on.
Right. I think, Bert, even 5 to 6 would be pretty good for the world. Even if one doesn't entertain outright recession in Europe and the US, it is a slower outlook, and a rebound from China. I'll take that balancing outcome, at least for 2023. You were describing the property market and you talked about a big mess. So I want to get a little deeper into the big mess of the property sector. In terms of reform, so we had the 3 red lines a couple of years ago. It seems like right now there's a bit of a step back from the 3 red lines. Direction of reforms, because it is a big mess and it has to be sorted out. Otherwise, it'll just become a big albatross around the neck of the economy.
So it's a very complicated. I mean, there's the property sector proper. Sorry for the double proper. But then there is the broader setting in which that property sector has become such an important part of the economy. And I think that is important as well. And that's really linked to local government, to revenues of local government, to the intergovernmental fiscal system that really now needs reforms. I mean, it's been almost 30 years that there was a serious reform of that fiscal sector. And I think China is ready for another wave of reforms there. On the property sector, so yes, the government basically saved a number of companies that got into trouble by the 3 red line policy, the very tight policy on leverage in property sector and on indebtedness. But it caused part of the problem because the property sector, developer companies were not able to borrow as much as before. They relied even more on pre-sales. So pre-sales became the vehicle by which they financed the construction of companies, of property. Technically, there is some sort of a guarantee on that, but in reality, it doesn't really work. So you had this moment where property companies started to basically default on their payments, and they simply didn't have money to finish their existing projects. That part, I think the government has more or less fixed. What it has not yet fixed is to think about, well, what kind of property sector do we want? And how should that look like? And there's been some policy pronouncements on that, and I think they're going in the right direction. I think everybody sort of agrees that it shouldn't go back to the old days, and the property sector shouldn't be 18% of GDP, some say even more, but we calculated something in the order of 18% of GDP. It should probably be less, and it should also be a very different kinds of sector. So it shouldn't be all the high-end apartments that would be good for the wealthier part of Chinese population. But there should be a lot of the next wave, if you want, of big demand will be for rental housing. It will be for low-income housing. It will be for the migrants who want to move out of their dorms and want to start building their existence for their families without having such high incomes as some of these apartments are built for. So that is still a decent property sector, and demand is not gone. Also, increasingly coming on the market is sort of replacement demand of a lot of the apartments built in the 80s and the 90s and even the 2000s. You say, well, maybe people want to live a little bigger, but also the quality of the buildings in those days was not that good. So there's quite a bit of replacement demand coming on stream as well. But in terms of new demand, I believe it's the migrants and the migrant workers that are in the cities and that they don't have, but that should be able to settle, have urban hukou, have access to financing for their apartments. That would be the next wave of demand. There will be a different kind of demand, and it will require different kinds of buildings. It would even require different kinds of longer-term finance. Probably the banks may not even be the greatest vehicle for that kind of finance, especially not in social housing. But there's other sources of finance, including the National Social Security Fund. It doesn't need massive returns. It does need a return, and a positive one, but it in other countries, that is often a source for social housing finance. So a lot of pieces of the puzzle need to come together. Then, if you no longer build only for these high-end, expensive apartments, local governments will get less for their land. They probably shouldn't sell as much land as they did anyway, but they do have a lot of burdens of social services, and that burden will only increase as the population ages and as new migrants come in. So they need new sources of revenues. And again, so going back to this property developer game promoted by local governments that need the revenues to build the infrastructure and provide the services, that would not be the direction that China should go.
Okay, so there is a lot of revenue need. There is need for dealing with an aging population, dealing with urban renewal, climate change, and so on. Bert, where will all this money come from?
Well, I have one simple solution that will probably not happen. But the simple solution is that China is also the largest carbon gas or greenhouse gas emitter in the world. And there's about 12 gigaton, 14 gigaton equivalent that China emits every year. If you were to tax that with an economically efficient rate, which is about $75 to $80 a ton, you'd raise 7% of GDP. I don't expect that to happen. I don't expect that to happen anytime soon, but China already has a carbon tax, actually, and one that is pretty close to that 75. They raise about $60 to $65 on fuel. So transport fuel. So cars, when you go and fill up, you actually pay about $60 a ton, implicitly a ton of CO2 emissions through that tax on it. Well, that can be expanded to industrial applications. It can even be expanded to energy and power production, given that the current system that has been introduced on an experimental basis, i.e., the cap and trade, frankly, brings about such a low price for carbon that it's hardly worth it. It's about $6 to $7 on the market right now, and there's very little trade. It seems that China is making the mistakes that Europe made 25 years ago. So I don't see much of an incentive coming from that cap and trade market. Therefore, there is a lot of scope for carbon pricing. The other one, look, China has said they want to do more common prosperity, and i.e., that also rich people would give back more to society. China, for now, seems to think that will be sort of donation-based, the tertiary distribution, as China calls it. But the more logical step is to simply tax richer people more. Currently, that hardly happens, and there's a reason, because capital gains are not taxed in China, except on housing. Interestingly enough, the various sources of income are taxed differently, so it's a scheduler income tax, and then also the exemption of the income tax is very high. So in China, you're exempt up to a level of 4 times the average wage, whereas if you look at the OECD countries, they give you an exemption until about a quarter to half of the average wage. So if you were to gradually put more people into the personal income tax by simply not increasing that personal exemption, you would gradually get more from the personal income tax. Right now, China gets 1% of GDP out of the personal income tax. The average OECD country gets 8% of GDP out of the personal income tax. True, Xi Jinping said we don't want to have a welfare state, we don't have a tax and spend. But if you look at Korea or Japan, that are not necessarily sort of Nordic welfare states, they still tax to about 4 to 5% of GDP in personal income tax. It's simply a good tax. China has a good tax, and that's the value-added tax. Very productive, very efficient. Unfortunately, it's also regressive, because poorer people, they spend more of their income on consumption than richer people do. And therefore, the tax burden coming from VAT is simply higher on low-income strata. So China should keep the VAT, but then compensate for the distributional effect through the personal income tax.
The sort of messaging that we get from the authorities with respect to fiscal reform, the things that you just talked about. Okay, let's put aside the idealized version of $75 a ton carbon tax on every single source of emission. Clearly, that's not going to happen. But in terms of corporate sector tax reform, personal tax reform, and sort of this view about the current taxation system being somewhat regressive, what is your reading? I mean, is there a alignment within the government that they need to go in the right direction on these things?
Well, unfortunately, no, not yet. I think there is gradually a deeper understanding that the current trajectory of the fiscal is not sustainable. That includes the recent measures taken during COVID. There's been a lot of tax exemption, a lot of VAT exemption of small and medium enterprises, a lot of exemption of social security premia for small and medium enterprises. That sounds good, but it also means that you basically empty the coffers of the National Social Security Fund that were already not enough to sustain the current pension system in the medium term. So a lot needs to happen. And I think the sustainability issue will in the end drive it. But once you want to address that sustainability issue, you need to bring in a lot of elements. That common prosperity theme that is very dear. It wasn't in the Central Economic Work Conference document, but it clearly hasn't gone away. And frankly, it makes sense for China to now aim for something which is a more shared phase of still growth, but more shared growth. and that can be done without chasing away the entrepreneurs, without controlling capital. It can be done by fairly sensible policies that would improve the sustainability of fiscal policies over time. It's not yet being debated that much. As a fact, the East Asian Institute, we just had a conference on fiscal policy for the new era, and we were honored by the presence of former Finance Minister Lo Ji-wei. He's one of the key thinkers on fiscal policies over the past 20, 25 years. And he was also, he did express a lot of areas where he said reforms would be possible, but was also less confident in stating that indeed those reforms are already on the books. I think there's time for this, and this requires a good academic debates. Then the policymakers in the ministries need to put the pen to paper and see what can be done politically and technically. And then, over time that needs to happen. It doesn't need to happen overnight. It doesn't need to happen this year. But that fiscal sustainability issue, expressing the commitment by the government to say, yes, we want in the medium term, we want that fiscal sustainability achieved, and we want fiscal instruments to play a role in common prosperity. And let me add a third. I would also say I want fiscal policies, on-budget fiscal policies, to play a role in macroeconomic stabilization. So the classic factors, the classic goals, objectives of fiscal policy, then that would give a lot of confidence that indeed those issues will be solved in the next 5 to 10 years.
Bert, earlier when you were talking about revenues, you started talking about the revenue coming from taxing emission and so on, and you talked about how the cap and trade system, or what is known as the emission trading system in China, is probably subject to the same sort of errors that the European ETS made 2 decades ago. Elaborate on that a little bit about, why do you think that there are these flaws in that system or that approach?
Yeah. So there's a couple of problems. And so the Europeans made exactly the same mistakes. First, China issued a lot of permits to emit. Okay. And they didn't auction them off. They gave them to existing polluters. That is very convenient, very comforting for the existing polluters, so they won't be in the way. As a matter of fact, they will make money out of it. And the state will not. So you hand out, and in this case, a lot. Normally you would say, well, you hand out as many as you think is sustainable, is necessary. And that would mean a reduction of emissions compared to before starting a cap and trade. But basically the caps were put at existing emissions. That's one reason why that price is very low. There's a second effect of that cap and trade that economists haven't really thought about yet, but it also actually makes entry much more difficult, entry into any sector much more difficult, because then you have to go out and buy those emissions. So your competitors got a handout from government on the permits, but you have to go and buy. So it distorts competition to some extent. A tax would not do that. A tax has other downsides, but the upsides of a cap and trade are theoretically that there would be smart people that invent new things to reduce emissions and then sell it or sell permits on the basis of that invention. That's the theory. I think if you look back on the experience over the past 25 years, it takes different instruments to get that done. Take solar. Solar was not suddenly profitable because there was a cap and trade in Europe. Solar was suddenly profitable because there was a feed-in tariff on electricity production, and that worked wonderfully well. Similarly now with electric vehicles, they become profitable because there's still heavy subsidies. So it's getting less, but there's still heavy subsidies on adopting an electric vehicle. And that then brings the production to scale, and that drives down costs. So I think that we know that is a very efficient way of doing it. The next areas that kind of policy can work is, one, carbon capture, and again, China can play a big role, and two would be hydrogen. And hydrogen is I mean, it's nothing new, and we know how to produce it. We know how to produce it in a clean way, the green hydrogen, but we don't really have a market yet, and it costs too much at the moment. So putting up a feed-in tariff would be a very good idea. And it would really make renewable energy tradable. Right now, one of the big downsides of renewables is that you can have your windmill in your backyard, but transporting it over vast lengths of space is very expensive because you lose a lot in the process. China has done a lot with high voltage transmission. So within the country, they're pretty efficient. The losses are pretty limited. But you'd really want make use of the sun in Saudi Arabia and in Australia and in Algeria. And that's probably all you need to get all the energy in the world. But then you need to get it out there. Hydrogen is a fantastic way to get from A to B. Actually, well, you first make ammoniac, but that's a technical detail because hydrogen is a bit explosive, so you don't want to have ships exploding. So you turn it into ammoniac, and then you turn it back into hydrogen on the point of destination. All those processes are known. There's nothing that needs to be invented. You just need to bring it to a scale where the costs are less than the alternatives. That was done miraculously well with solar, pretty well with wind, not yet with other alternatives. So, and cap and trade, frankly, is almost completely disconnected from that. The only mechanism that was in place was the clean development mechanism, i.e., and the World Bank, where I used to work, they played a role in that, i.e., they basically transferred money from the EU to China and other countries to reduce their carbon emission as sort of a means of and that was then based on the trading in the policies, the Kyoto Protocol policies that were implemented in Europe. I think those days may simply be gone, simply because it requires a level of international cooperation that may no longer be available. Giving subsidies to China to become less polluting may not be the most popular political proposition at this point in time, even though it might economically be the right thing to do.
Okay, so you just made the perfect segue to my next question, which is on climate change. I hear from Western experts on security side as well as on climate change side that the U.S. has more or less given up on China. They'll do their thing, and the U.S. will find allies in Europe and elsewhere to make progress on climate change. So is China just going to go at it alone, or do you see there being some scope for international cooperation on taxonomy and the ETS best practice and so on?
Look, on ETS, I don't know, but on a number of technologies, there is actually a perfect, some competition is fine. Some competition is absolutely fine. And looking for the next IP that would help create, the miracles that we by now need in order to stay below 1.5 degrees of temperature increase. But there is actually a very good complementarity between China and the rest of the world. And because China has two advantages. One, they have a very big scale. Two, they have enormous manufacturing capacity. And go back to the story of solar. It was not Chinese IP. It was Australian IP and European IP. And China took that, used the German policy tool, German invented policy tool of feed-in tariff, and made that a success. They were a little bit naughty because they didn't allow others to come in, and there was real issues. So frankly, there was distortion in trade there. Same now is happening with batteries, for instance, where China is conducting an industrial policy that impedes trade, and it would be a case that you could bring to the WTO. Western countries never brought China to the WTO on except for the solar panel issue, but that was a fairly targeted issue. So there's issues with China's policy, but at the same time, if you suppose you, Timur, in the rest of the afternoon, you would invent the miracle to do carbon capture in the most efficient way. Well, where would you go? You wouldn't do it in Singapore. You wouldn't, probably not even in Europe, because Europe is, yes, it's united, but it's not really, because there's still lots of countries. You go to China and bring it to scale. So that scale and the manufacturing capability to bring things to scale is enormously important. And if you were to sort of do your own thing, you would lose that complementarity. I don't think it will be a total loss, because I think some of the competition is good, and some of the competition will also be good for other countries, for third countries that might benefit from competition between, say, a Western solution and a Chinese solution. But there would be losses as well.
Right. I remember having a conversation with David Victor, who wrote that book, Making Climate Policy Work. And he made one point that, we as economists, had all sorts of market-based solutions in mind for dealing with climate change. But over the last 2-3 decades, to your point about Europe's experience on ETS, is that we've come to the conclusion you need a lot of top-down nudges, whether setting price of carbon or even the quantity that could be traded within the exchange. All of that has to come from the regulator or the government or whatever. And from that perspective, China, I suppose, is, even if it goes on its own and is just being a source of competition as opposed to complementarity, might, who knows, work out. Bert, moving from the green agenda, I want to talk a bit about tech. The tech sector regulation, of course, was a huge theme for China in the last couple of years. In fact, it's not just a China thing. I mean, the rest of the world as well, there are regulators and governments grappling with data privacy and oligopoly or monopoly nature of large tech firms. So what do you make of the seismic actions of the last few years? And now that we're seeing some easing of those actions, I mean, what do they imply for China's tech entrepreneurs and also the future of innovation in China?
Right. Well, looking back over the past 2-3 years on the regulatory crackdown and the effects of it, I think there's some upsides and some downsides to that. I think the downside was really the way it was done, the suddenness with which the regulatory atmosphere changed, and it will make investors in tech a little bit queasy for a long time to come, because who knows who's next. That, I think, is the long-term damage. If you look at some of the upsides, China has some of the concerns that have been debated for, by now, decades in the United States, in Europe. Europe is a bit different because they never managed to basically bring about a sort of a tech company at scale at the level of Google or Facebook or otherwise. China has, in part by keeping them out, by keeping the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons out. That in part was distortion of competition, no question about it. But it did deliver them a viable alternative. So they've done well in that sense in the first 2 decades. When this started to result into monopolistic behavior of those platforms, China intervened. China has the political system to behave like that. It's a lot more complex in the West, I recognize that. But they actually did it. And they did it also with the purpose of indeed rectifying some of the monopolistic behaviors of the Alibabas and the JD, the Tencents of the world. So that seems very reasonable. Then beyond that, there is something that is much more political, control-oriented, like censorship of games and others. And then there is the common prosperity, reducing the burden on the on the middle income households by banning online tutoring. I don't know how that helps, but that was at least a stated motivation. No, because the tutoring is not going to go away. It's just not going to be online. It's going to be in person, and then only the rich can afford the in person. So frankly, I think that was wrong-headed, but that was the stated motivation. So one can understand that was a policy action. I think it was the wrong policy action. But leaving that aside, so China is now, as per statement in the Central Economic Work Conference, Liu He also said a number of things in Davos, and so they're in calmer water in the regulation. The regulation is not going to go away. It will be the market will be regulated by the government so that the optimal outcome for society results, not the optimal outcome for the owners of the company. And that sounds for some, for Americans maybe that sounds scary, but frankly it is the way most Europeans would think about a company. So you regulate the market and such that you get the optimal outcome. And as a fact, it's Adam Smith's first book was all about that. People like to read The Wealth of Nations, but the first book was all about the moral sentiments and the moral cultural setting in which a market takes place. So nothing new under the sun in that sense. And that will look different in China than it will look in Europe, which is different from how it looks in the United States or how it looks in Japan. That market is not one thing. It's a social construct, if you want. I think as a result, and I'm sure I'm not going to make your investors happy, but as a result, the valuation of those companies will be less than previous expectations. Okay, previous expectation was like, well, my goodness, the sky's the limit, because even if you count Alibaba and JD and others, if you add them all up, they still only have 30% of the retail market, and it could go to 60 or 90%. So I think some of that sort of infinite possibilities is gone. Second, and that there I'm of two minds, but I think we'll find that relatively soon, and that is on the financial side, because the one thing where I think the government in a way got the wrong motivation was with the fintech. Now, the fintech, as built on the back of the e-commerce transactions by Alibaba, by Tencent, by others, was actually a very efficient way of getting money to small companies. And it was big competition, of course, for the banks. And for the banks, I think, were the big beneficiaries of the crackdown on the Ant Finance and others. I think that also had real economic costs. So right now we have back a return to these promoting the policies for credit to small and medium enterprises. Well, it wasn't an issue when Ant Finance could provide the credits on the basis of the payment behavior of companies. They could approve your credit in, what was it? It was in 3 seconds, I think they said that they claimed that they could do. So I think there the government should reconsider what do they want to keep there. And indeed, the proof of the pudding is, will Ant Finance be able to go back to IPO? It will probably, again, be at a valuation much less than before. Before, I think the plans were to issue something that would lead to a valuation almost $300 billion. I think that's history, but still, there's still lots of value even in the regulated Ant Finance model. So the government should go ahead. The government should go ahead and allow that competition for the traditional banks who haven't been doing their job. It's also competition two ways. Yes, there may have been anti-competitive behavior in the online sphere. There's also anti-competitive behavior in the traditional industries in China. So they should address that as well.
I wanted to sort of go back to the very first point you made in answer to my question, which is that maybe it will have a negative impact on the overall entrepreneurial zeal. You probably will not have a lot of upside, to your point, Ant will not be 300 billion. So a budding entrepreneur growing up in China, would they want to go down the rather challenging route of being an entrepreneur and deal with all the pain and risk of failure when the upside is going to be fundamentally lower?
Well, so look, I think there's still, frankly, knowing China and knowing the people from China, there will be tons of entrepreneurs. And one of the incredibly striking statistics is the number of new companies registered ever since Li Keqiang made mass entrepreneurship his policy. A lot of these companies went under during COVID and even before, but startups, they go under, unfortunately. So I think there's still a lot of entrepreneurial zeal. What is a risk, and that is in the short term maybe an opportunity for places such as Singapore, but what is a risk that people opt out earlier. So I think uncertainty on that regulatory environment, I don't think it will stop entrepreneurial activity, but it would change your entrepreneurial activity, i.e., you want to make money and then set up your family office in Singapore and live off the proceeds from that. That's a very different kind of entrepreneurship that brings about the very big innovations. That brings about the mRNAs where you need a 10-year, 15-year horizon. So with regulatory uncertainty, you shorten the horizon for entrepreneurs, and they do different things. I don't think that is healthy for China. And I think China would do well in really very deliberately restoring some of that regulatory certainty. And that regulatory certainty doesn't need to, that's almost irrespective of a political system. I mean, it's this predictability in the processes. It's the fair hearings. It's the floating first ideas and white papers on regulations in particular areas, giving people an opportunity to talk about that. That's not all too radical and not too dissimilar from what China's already doing, had been doing. So I think some of that would need to come back to restore some of the confidence.
Okay. Switching gears again, I read obituaries of Belt and Road these days in various journals that it's been a spectacular failure and waste of China's capital and diplomatic overtures, and it will just end up creating a bunch of white elephants, or at its worst, highly indebted countries which will end up defaulting. What's your sense?
Well, that's not my sense. I think there is, if you look at the numbers, and there's been some recent papers on new databases, because the numbers are not that great. You get a lot of announcements from China. The realization, the numbers are a little bit difficult to get. So if you take the new databases, the net disbursement on overseas investment from China almost came to a halt during COVID. And I think that's almost by necessity. So there was a lot needed at home, a lot of fiscal resources were needed at home. So some of the overseas investments simply fell by the wayside. Second, yes, there have been issues. And some countries, I won't name them, then accuse China of pursuing a debt trap diplomacy. Frankly, that is not in China's interest, and China doesn't do that. What China does do is take more risk, and that is not always, doesn't always pan out. But the counterfactual of that is that they've actually been a lot more flexible in rescheduling debt. If you look at China's record on rescheduling debt, they've been really quite good at it, and bringing solutions such as a debt equity swap, which is maligned in international circles. But what happened with the famous Hambantota port was that China took an equity stake in there simply to wipe out the debt. It shouldn't have been debt financed. Probably shouldn't have been financed. But the then president of Sri Lanka really wanted to have that port. Then it should have been financed with so much debt. So the debt equity swap was actually a solution. And the contract that Chinese contractor did to run it for 100 years was a solution for the project. People failed to see that, but there was a lot of engineering, a lot of financial engineering to make the best of it. It's still never going to be great, or not for a long time, but at least now there's a fighting chance. China's done a number of other investments, just like others. The World Bank had a success rate of its investments of about 70%. 70%, not 100%, 70%. So it's a pretty good bank, I think. They've been around for a long time. So it's not that every development finance becomes a success. The World Bank maybe does more difficult stuff like building health systems and conditional cash transfers. Maybe that's more difficult than infrastructure, but not every project became a success. Same with China. Not every project becomes a success. Some of the incentives in the system as it is, i.e. quite a decentralized mobilization of projects, is probably less desirable if you want to make a good initiative of global connectivity, which by itself is a good idea. So, long story short, I think there's a bit of a pause. China needs some of those more resources at home, but it's not gone. It is a key initiative of Xi Jinping. It won't go away. It's morphing a little bit into something broader even. It's a global development initiative, and part of, if you want, the Belt and Road is part of that global development initiative. But as you say, it's also not just about infrastructure. It's about diplomacy. It's about policy coordination. It's about financial integration, i.e., alternatives to the dollar-based system. So it's a lot more than just a bit of infrastructure around the world. So it's not gone. It will be back. And frankly, a big part of the investments are quite okay.
Right. And if it was such an unmitigated disaster, we would not be seeing now the US, for example, redouble its effort to create its own sort of framework.
Just small. Also Belt and Road, just smaller.
Right. Bert, US-China rivalry. It seems like, there is no end to it. Not a week goes by when I don't read one more action by the Americans to widen the tech gap between the US and the Chinese. And we see increasing efforts to widen that sort of, coalition, if you will. The Dutch are joining in terms of ASML's, ability to sell technology to China. And the idea that, TSMC produces right next door to China, but its frontier products will not be accessible to China, seems to me rather dangerous as far as the China's sense of security is concerned. Where do you see this whole rivalry going?
Well, I hope it will end somewhere on a table where some sensible solutions are being discussed. But failing that, and there's now been this talk, not yet an official reaction from China, but talk about possible countermeasures. The one that was prominently discussed in Beijing was on solar panels and solar technology, where China is now in the lead. And they say, well, our national security may require us to limit the exports of that technology. I don't know how serious that is, but clearly China might be looking for some retaliation. And of course, you want to hit those sectors that are very high priority to the country that is trying to restrict you. There's other areas where China has an uncomfortable hold over the U.S. The U.S. may not yet be aware, but more on the more positive side, on a different take. China will, of course, now double down on developing its own technology, and it's hard, and they have failed in the past. But in the past, they could fail because there was always an alternative. Right now, there is no alternative. And so it will bring a very different kind of dynamic to the next phase of semiconductor development. And take the ASML, the extreme ultraviolet lithography. That's incredibly hard to pull together with thousands of components coming from hundreds of companies. But But in the end, if you take your time, you would probably be able to do it. I mean, ASML didn't start with that machine. It took them 20 years to build that machine and importing lots of technologies. So building a supply chain that can make an ultraviolet lithography, extreme ultraviolet lithography, that may take some time, but it's now absolutely necessary for China. So that's the irony. So you gave a very strong incentive where China failed before. Now you give the strongest incentive to China to succeed. So there probably would have been alternative pathways where you say, well, we're going to continue to deliver you chips for a whole range of things, so just not for areas that are linked directly to military. So I think the measures have been too broad brushed. And second, and that is probably more fundamental. I mean, it's very hard to go back. If the US would now say, "Oh no, but we didn't mean it, and we're going to be okay," the trust is gone. So China would basically continue that course of action, I think, to develop alternatives, and then over time, it will be of a different ecosystem that could potentially still be narrow, say limited to things such as semiconductors, but it could also be much broader. I mean, in the National Security Advisor's speech that announced or that previewed the measures that were put in place a month later by Commerce, there were a number of other sectors mentioned. And so China thinks, well, what sector is going to be next? So they will take a very different take on technology development. They would want to now put it to very serious use to really reduce the reliance. It will be difficult and it will be costly. It will be costly for China in the short run, but it will also be costly for others because China will probably also not share some of the new technology that they develop with other countries. The IMF has made some guesstimate, because it's very hard to make estimates on what this actually cost. They said a sort of a total decoupling in the technology sphere would cost about 0.5%, 0.6% of growth to China, but it will also cost the West quite a bit of growth. So it's very unfortunate that we are where we are. Look, it's way beyond economics. It's national security. It is politics. It is perceptions on what the other side wants in this world. So that's a very big conversation that we can't have on podcasts. But so complex, not going in the right direction at this point, and it will have spin-offs like ASML. Being a Dutch person, I know that a lot of my friends are quite unhappy because it simply cost ASML a market. And they are the best in the world and they're proud of it. And now they can't sell to all the clients that they want to. And it happens to be a very big client, China.
No, it's not just ASML. I mean, NVIDIA is another company where the second these restrictions went into place, we see it impact very negatively on the share price because they made a huge amount of money selling these high-end chips to Chinese gaming companies and Chinese internet companies and so on. So I hear you that it's a lose-lose proposition, but I also hear you that it's probably here to stay. Final question, Bert. Companies will not stand on the sidelines on all these China plus one discussion and so on. You're seeing Korean, Japanese companies, trying to create multiple supply chains and so on. But what about Chinese companies themselves? Would Chinese capital become very strategic around the China plus one? And by that, I mean, would we see Chinese companies trying to do M&As or acquisitions in Vietnam and Malaysia, et cetera, so that they can use made in Vietnam stamp?
So I think we've already seen a little bit of that in reaction to the Trump tariffs, and some more of that might happen in the future. And it sits a little bit uneasy with China's other strand, and that is its dual circulation, where they want to onshore as much of critical supply chains, but maybe the less critical supply chains they might be more comfortable in moving abroad, and part of that will be indeed done by Chinese companies. I cannot imagine that they would, put a lot of tech money into Vietnam or Singapore and otherwise that they want to have onshore. That's part of their objectives. Of course, a lot of the money that will move, and still, I think we're still largely talking about moving rather than actually moving, The only, the very concrete case, and everybody knows it, the Foxconn case, where they open up facilities in India that might potentially be down the road be an alternative. There's some car makers that are looking at Indonesia, more beefing up of Thailand, but a lot of it is still a lot of talk, because also people still like the Chinese market. For European companies, far more than for US companies, frankly. They're more deeply embedded into the Chinese economy. I mean, yes, all the apples are made in China, but none of them are actually made by an American company. They're made by a Taiwanese company. So it's a very different kind of embedding than, say, having a wholly owned subsidiary like BASF has that opens a $10 billion facility in Guangdong. That's bricks and mortar right there, with all the risks that you can imagine. So there's a lot of talk, and if you look at the surveys of foreign investors, a lot of talk that they are now seriously looking at. The way I sort of said it, it went from the whiteboard of the strategy department to the boardroom. So now it is boardroom stuff, and big investments, additional investments in China now. Before they were almost sort of automatically approved. Now they're being screened on supply chain risk, but especially vulnerability to geopolitical risk, because that's the most difficult one to handle for any company, because you get these unpleasant surprises like Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Who had expected that? And suddenly we're there. So that's, I think, very difficult risk to manage, and that will influence investment flows around the world. Some of them from China, but China has different reasons for investing abroad, in part because they become too expensive.
That's right. Bert, what a sweeping, discourse on China. I'm very grateful for your terrific insights and very nuanced analysis. Thank you, Bert.
My pleasure. Good to be back, and maybe we'll make it a fourth time.
It will be in the three figures of Kopi time by then for sure. But yeah, you will be the first one to make that. I can guarantee you that. So thank you, Bert, and thanks to our listeners. Kopi time was produced by Ken Delbridge from Splice Studios. Daisy Sharma and Violet Lee provided additional assistance. This podcast is for information only and does not offer any investment advice. All 93 episodes of Kopi time are available on YouTube and on all major platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications and webinar recordings, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.